I want to start today with a statistic that is, well, it's frankly a little uncomfortable for some people to talk about. It almost feels like it borders on a taboo.
Right, because the implications people draw from it.
Exactly. But the numbers are just so staggering that you really can't ignore them. So if you look at the global population, Jewish people make up about 0.2%. That is essentially a rounding error in the grand scheme of things. It's a tiny fraction of humanity.
It really is. I mean, depending on how you count, we are talking about roughly 15 million people in a world of 8 billion.
Right. But if you look at the Nobel Prizes awarded between 1901 and today, in chemistry, physics, economics, medicine, that same 0.2% of the population represents over 20% of the winners.
It's a massive statistical anomaly. You are looking at an overrepresentation of something like 100 to 1.
100 to 1. And because that gap is so huge, you inevitably hear people whispering, or honestly sometimes just shouting on the internet, about this concept of Jewish genius.
Oh, absolutely. The implication is always that there is some special biological advantage, right? Some high IQ gene that somehow evolved over thousands of years of isolation.
But the sources we've gathered for today's deep dive are really here to completely dismantle that idea.
That is the mission today. We are going to look at the history, and not just the highlight reel, but the deep structural history, to argue that this phenomenon really has almost nothing to do with biology or DNA.
It's entirely about environment.
Exactly. It is about opportunity.
So the thesis for our deep dive today is basically this. Genius isn't some magical trait you're just born with. It's what happens when a marginalized culture finally gets a library card.
I love that phrasing.
Yes.
Yes, essentially. High achievement is a byproduct of a specific group gaining access to what we might call the schoolmaster of civilization.
And we're going to trace this mechanism all the way from ancient Babylon right up to modern immigrant success stories in Silicon Valley.
We are. And we'll also look at a really sobering counterexample later with the history of the Roma people. It proves the point better than almost anything else.
I think so too. But let's actually start at the beginning, because I think most people listening probably have this assumption that the ancient Israelites were always these intellectual heavyweights. They gave us the Bible, so they must have been doing advanced calculus out in the desert.
Right, that is the common retroactive assumption. We look at the success of the 20th century, and we just project it backward. But if you actually look at the ancient Near East around, say, the 1000 BCE, the Israelites were absolutely not the ones winning the science fair.
They were kind of scientific late bloomers, weren't they?
Very much so. You have to remember, you were surrounded by absolute giants back then. To the east, you had Sumer and Babylon. To the west, you had Egypt.
And these weren't just big armies.
No, they were intellectual powerhouses. I mean, the Sumerians gave us the concept of the 60-second minute, the 360-degree circle.
Which you and I still use every single time we look at a clock or a compass.
Exactly. And the Babylonians were tracking planetary movements with incredibly complex algebra. They had these massive royal academies devoted entirely to astronomy.
And the Egyptians were using advanced geometry to align the pyramids with, frankly, terrifying precision.
Right. And the Persians were building road networks and governance systems that were light years ahead of everyone else.
So where were the Israelites in all of this?
They were shepherding. They were a really small, tribal, agrarian society living up in the hill country. Now, we have to be fair here. They did contribute something massive to humanity.
Monotheism, the prophets, the Psalms.
Exactly. They created a revolutionary ethical framework that fundamentally changed the world. But in terms of secular science, math, architecture, they weren't really on the map.
Because they didn't have the infrastructure.
Right. They didn't have the urban academies or the royal patronage that the Babylonians had.
So if I'm an average Israelite living in 800 BCE, I'm probably not discovering the Pythagorean theorem.
No. And not because you aren't smart enough, but because you just don't have the environment. You don't have the schoolmaster. You are quite literally outside the library.
Okay, so when does that change? Because obviously something massive shifted at some point.
The first major turning point is Alexander the Great.
The Macedonian conqueror.
Right. When Alexander sweeps through the Near East in the 4th century BCE, he doesn't just bring soldiers. He brings Hellenism.
The Greek way of thinking.
Yes. Rationalism, philosophy, systematic logic. He plants these cities all over the place, like Alexandria in Egypt, which basically becomes the Silicon Valley of the ancient world.
And the Jewish population gets swept up in this new hub?
They were forced into contact with it by the conquest. Suddenly you have a massive Jewish community living in Alexandria. They start speaking Greek as their first language. They even translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. That's the famous Septuagint.
But the crucial part is they start trying to reconcile their religious beliefs with this new, very cool Greek science.
Right. It's exactly that.
It's almost like a software update. They're trying to run Torah 1.0 on Greek operating system 2.0.
That is a perfect analogy. And the result of that collision is a figure like Philo of Alexandria.
Tell us about Philo.
So he lived roughly around the time of Jesus. He is a Jewish philosopher, but he's writing in Greek, and he's using Plato's ideas to explain Moses. He's using Greek allegory and metaphysics.
So Philo is essentially the first Jewish genius in the secular academic sense?
He's certainly one of the first. But here is the critical insight we need to pull from the sources. Philo does not exist without Alexander the Great.
Because the environment wouldn't be there.
Precisely. If the Greeks hadn't conquered Egypt, if they hadn't built the great library of Alexandria and forced that cultural collision, Jewish thought would likely have remained focused purely on ritual and prophecy. Philo's genius was a direct product of his access to the Greek library.
So the door opens, they get access to the institutions, and suddenly you get a world-class philosopher. That really sets the pattern.
It does. And we see this pattern repeat even more clearly in the next major era we have to cover, which is the Islamic Golden Age.
Now, this is a period I feel like Western history classes often just gloss right over. We usually jump from the fall of Rome straight to the Renaissance. But in the middle, while Europe is having its so-called Dark Ages, the Middle East is just lighting up.
Oh, it was the absolute center of the world's intellectual gravity. After the Arab conquests in the 7th century, you have the Abbasid Caliphate rising in Baghdad.
And they were obsessed with knowledge.
Obsessed. Yeah. They created the House of Wisdom. They funded this massive movement to translate Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, and Ptolemy into Arabic. You had Muslim innovators doing the heavy lifting like Al-Khwarizmi with algebra and algorithms and Al-Razi in medicine.
And Jewish people were living right in the middle of this.
Yes. Under Islamic rule, Jews were classified as dhimmis.
Let's define that for the listener, just so we're clear on the social dynamic.
Sure. Dhimmi means a protected person. It is definitely second-class citizenship. You have to pay a special tax, and you have fewer legal rights than a Muslim.
Yeah.
But, and this is key, you are physically safe.
You aren't being expelled or killed.
Right. And crucially, you are integrated into the economy and the intellectual life of the empire.
So they have access to the open market of ideas. They have the library card again.
Exactly. Jews spoke Arabic. They became doctors, merchants, translators. And because the Muslim world was building this massive scientific infrastructure, Jews rode that exact same wave.
I was reading the source notes on Maimonides, who is arguably the biggest name in Jewish medieval history. And this fact completely blew my mind. He wrote his masterpiece in Arabic.
It surprises everyone. Maimonides wrote his code of Jewish law, the Mishneh Torah, in Hebrew. But his major philosophical work, the Guide for the Perplexed, that was written in Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic spoken language, just written using the Hebrew alphabet.
And why does that detail matter so much for our thesis?
Because it shows he wasn't thinking in a bubble. He was actively quoting Muslim philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes to explain the Bible. He was debating astronomy and medicine based purely on Islamic scientific standards. He was deeply embedded in the Arabic intellectual tradition.
So if Maimonides had lived in, say, rural France at the exact same time, instead of Cairo or Cordoba, he wouldn't have been the Maimonides we know today.
He might have been a highly respected, brilliant local rabbi, but he wouldn't have been a philosopher of science. He simply wouldn't have had the tools.
The environment.
Right. The Jewish Golden Age in medieval times was essentially an offshoot of the Islamic Golden Age. The Muslims built the university, and the Jews utilized it.
I really love that framing. Okay, so we've established that genius appears wherever the dominant civilization opens its doors. Now, let's jump to the big one. Europe. The Enlightenment.
This is where the modern world really begins, and where those staggering statistics we started with actually come from.
Because for centuries before this, Europe was actually a terrible place for Jewish intellectualism.
Horrific. You had the Crusades, the Inquisition, the ghetto system. Jews were legally barred from universities and guilds.
And you can't be a world-class scientist if you legally cannot get into the lab.
Precisely. So they were focused entirely on survival and internal religious study. But then comes the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th centuries. You have the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, led by thinkers like Moses Mendelssohn in Berlin.
He was the one arguing that Jews should learn German and study secular subjects.
He wanted to bridge that gap.
Yeah.
And then Napoleon comes along and literally kicks down the ghetto walls across Europe.
Emancipation.
It spreads across the continent. Suddenly, for the very first time in European history, a Jewish kid can apply to the University of Berlin or the University of Vienna or the Sorbonne. They could study medicine, law, physics.
And what happens when that gate opens?
An absolute explosion. It is almost instantaneous in historical terms. Within just 2 or 3 generations of getting access to these institutions, you go from a marginalized, isolated community to producing Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr.
It really is incredibly fast. It's like you open the gate and 50 years later you get the theory of relativity and psychoanalysis.
And this speed is the key evidence against the whole genetic argument. You cannot evolve a physics gene in 60 years. That is just not how biology works. Biology takes millennia. This transformation happened in the blink of an eye.
That makes the biological argument look pretty flimsy. But our sources bring up another comparison that I found even more compelling to prove this point. The control group.
Ah, yes. This is the strongest logical proof we have. While European Jews were winning 25% of the Nobel Prizes in the early 20th century, what about the Jews living in Yemen or Kurdistan or Morocco?
They were the same ethnicity. They practiced the same religion.
They had the same DNA, if you want to call it that.
But they weren't producing quantum mechanics.
No. And why not? Because there was no University of Berlin in Yemen, there was no widespread emancipation and institutional access in Kurdistan at that time.
So if it were truly a Jewish gene, you would see Einstein-level physics popping up out of every single Jewish community globally.
Exactly. But you didn't. You only saw it where the local environment provided the institutional tools.
That distinction is huge. It's not the people, it's the institution they plug into. The European university system was the schoolmaster that allowed all that latent human potential to just explode.
It was a catalyst. But we do have to look at the flip side of this equation. We've talked about what happens when you get access, what happens when you have proximity to the institutions but you don't get access.
And this brings us to the tragic counterexample of the Roma people.
It's a very heavy comparison, but a vital one for understanding this dynamic.
The Roma, historically referred to as gypsies, arrived in Europe from India roughly around 1000 to 1300 CE. So they arrive at essentially the same time Ashkenazi Jewish communities are forming in certain parts of Eastern and Central Europe.
Right, so they had the exact same proximity to the European schoolmaster. They are physically in Europe. They are breathing the same air, living in the same countries.
But the outcome is completely different.
It is the dark inverse of the Jewish story. Instead of eventual emancipation and university access, the Roma faced horrific, systemic exclusion. In places like Wallachia and Moldavia, they faced outright enslavement for centuries.
Enslavement in Europe?
Yes, chattel slavery, right up until the mid-1800s. And in regions where they weren't enslaved, they were legally excluded, criminalized, and kept on the absolute margins of society. They were never, ever granted that library card.
And of course, we know the Roma were also targeted for extermination in the Holocaust alongside the Jews.
The progemos, they call it. The devouring.
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands were murdered. But the analytical point for our discussion about genius is this. Why is there no Roma golden age of science? Why are there no Roman Nobel Prize winners from that early 20th century era?
Well, because you can't produce a Nobel Prize winner if you aren't legally allowed to own property or learn to read.
Exactly. Proximity isn't enough. You need inclusion. The Roma had the exact same human capacity, because human potential is universal, but the environment was a permanently closed door.
It proves that you can live right next door to the library for 500 years, but if the guard actively prevents you from going inside, nothing is going to happen.
That is a deeply sobering reality check. It really highlights that talent is universally abundant, but opportunity is artificially scarce.
Talent is abundant, opportunity is scarce. That is the catchphrase of this whole deep dive right there.
It really is.
Okay, so let's fast forward to today, because this isn't just a history lesson about Jews and Roma in the 20th century. This exact pattern is repeating right now, in real time, in the UK, in the US, but with a completely different group of people.
It is the exact same sociological dynamic. If you look at the post-World War II migration to the West, you see a brand new cast of characters playing the exact same historical role.
We're talking about immigrants from South Asia and East Asia.
Right. Think about the UK context specifically. You have the Windrush generation, And the massive waves of migration from India and Pakistan in the 50s and 60s. Who were these people when they arrived?
They were laborers. They drove the buses, they worked in the textile mills, they staffed the National Health Service.
Exactly. That's the classic first-generation immigrant story.
Mm.
It's all about struggle, survival, keeping your head down, and sacrificing for your kids.
But then look at the data for the second and third generations.
It is staggering. In the UK today, British Asians, specifically those of Indian and Chinese heritage, are outperforming the national averages in education by a massive margin. They are completely dominating the GCSE results.
And it isn't just test scores either. Look at who is actually running things now.
It's remarkable. In the US, you have the CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, both of Indian origin.
And in the UK, you recently had Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister, Sadiq Khan as the Mayor of London.
Humza Yousaf in Scotland. You have these children of immigrants whose parents were very often working-class laborers, rising to the absolute top of politics, technology, and medicine within just 1 or 2 generations.
It sounds exactly like the Jewish story in 19th century Germany.
Because it is the Jewish story. Sociologically, it is identical. You have a marginalized group that places a hyper-intense cultural value on education as a safety net. They push their kids relentlessly. And crucially, they are doing this in Western democracies that, despite all their flaws and systemic issues, have open institutions.
So sociologically speaking, someone like Rishi Sunak is basically the modern equivalent of a Disraeli or a Freud.
Yes, he represents the specific historical moment when the outsider group fully masters the tools of the dominant culture and rises to the very top. It just confirms our thesis again. Opportunity plus institutional access equals genius.
It's basically a renewable resource. It happens over and over whenever you combine hungry, motivated people with open institutions.
That is the formula.
But, and there is always a but in history, this transition isn't always smooth. We've talked a lot about the success, but we also need to talk about the anxiety it causes. Because whenever a new group enters the library, the people who are already inside tend to get very nervous.
We absolutely have to talk about the backlash. And in the sources we reviewed, there is no starker example of this historical anxiety than Enoch Powell.
The famous Rivers of Blood speech from 1968.
It is infamous for a very good reason. Powell was a leading British conservative politician and a highly educated classicist himself. He looked at this influx of Commonwealth immigrants, people arriving from India, the Caribbean, Pakistan, and he predicted total societal catastrophe.
And as we impartially look at the text of that speech, he didn't just express mild economic concern. He used apocalyptic, violent language.
He did. He quoted the Roman poet Virgil saying, "I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood." He genuinely believed that these immigrants would never fit in. He argued that they would refuse to integrate and would ultimately destroy the British way of life.
He literally said the nation was heaping up its own funeral pyre by allowing them in.
Yes. He thought diversity was a death sentence for the nation.
But look at the reality of what actually happened. Look at the data we just went through. Powell feared these people would destroy the country. Instead, 50 years later, their children and grandchildren are running the country's biggest companies, leading its political parties, and treating its patients in the NHS.
The people he thought were the ultimate threat became the nation's greatest assets.
Exactly.
And that's the profound takeaway. The historical data, from the Jewish experience in Alexandria and Berlin, all the way to the Asian experience in London and Silicon Valley, it completely refutes Powell's fear. It proves that inclusive institutions turn outsiders into the very engine that drives a nation forward.
That is such a powerful thought, because we usually frame the immigration debate as a charitable act, let them in to help them. But this historical pattern suggests it's actually a completely self-interested strategy for national brilliance.
It is the ultimate engine of innovation. But again, only if the environment allows it. If you have the people, but you actively deny them access, like the horrific history of the Roma car, you lose all that potential. It stays locked away forever.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this today?
It means we need to completely stop looking for genius in our DNA and start looking for it in our social policy. If we want the next Einstein or the next Google, we shouldn't be obsessing over genetics or ethnicity. We should be obsessing over access.
Asking who is standing outside the library right now.
Exactly. Who has the potential, but not the key.
Because history shows us the genius is already out there. It's just waiting for the door to open.
Precisely.
Which leaves me with a final thought for you to chew on after this deep dive ends. If the physical institutions, the universities, the royal academies were the schoolmasters of the past, what is the schoolmaster today? Is it the internet? Is it AI? And if it is, who is currently being excluded from that digital library? Because whoever we're locking out right now might just be the ones holding the next great leap in human progress.
History strongly suggests they are.
Well, we're going to leave it there for today's deep dive. It's definitely a lot to think about, especially when you look at the political debates happening right now.
History might not repeat, but it certainly rhymes.
It certainly does. Thanks for listening, everyone. Let us know what you think, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.